Celina Aragoza thought her secret would stay hidden forever, until Dr. Keiran Solace decided her unborn child was worth killing for, and Dr. Arwen Larke vanished into the night with the infant no one was supposed to know existed. Celina Aragoza had always lived a careful life. Growing up in a small coastal town in the Philippines taught her to be disciplined, patient, and grateful for every opportunity. Her mother worked as a laundry vendor, her father as a tricycle driver, and Celina spent most of her youth studying under dim fluorescent lights. Her dream of becoming a nurse was not just a career choice, it was her promise to lift her family from a lifetime of quiet struggle. When she finally received an offer to work in Singapore, she believed the future she had imagined was finally coming to life. She packed lightly, hugged her family tightly, and stepped onto the plane with a mixture of fear and hope. Singapore greeted her with order and precision. The clean streets, organized transport, and towering buildings felt worlds away from the noisy, colorful chaos she grew up in. Celina adapted quickly to her new environment, determined not to disappoint anyone back home. She worked at Sierra Vista Medical Center, a private hospital surrounded by corporate offices and expensive apartments. The hospital's reputation for excellence came with heavy expectations. Nurses were required to follow strict protocols, maintain spotless records, and avoid anything that could affect the hospital's image. Celina took pride in meeting every one of those demands. Her life followed a predictable routine. She woke before sunrise, prepared instant coffee in her small rented room, took the train to work, and spent long hours walking through patient wards. She was quiet but friendly, known for her gentle touch and precise work. At night, she returned home exhausted but content, checking in with her family through video calls before falling asleep. Though she lived in one of Asia's busiest cities, her world felt small and controlled. She thought this stability would last for years. Everything changed when she met Dr. Keiran Solace. Keiran was one of the hospital's most admired surgeons. His reputation was built on his meticulous attention to detail and a long record of successful operations. He carried himself with confidence and authority, and even the senior nurses treated him with respect. Celina first noticed him during a complicated post-operative case. He complimented her steady hands while she assisted with monitoring equipment, and the recognition filled her with a pride she rarely allowed herself. From that moment, Keiran seemed to pay more attention to her. He walked through the wards with calm precision, yet his eyes always lingered in Celina's direction. He found reasons to pass her station, review charts near her desk, or offer feedback on her routines. At first, Celina convinced herself it was normal. Surgeons often observed nurses, but gradually, their interactions became personal. He asked about her life in the Philippines, her family, her dreams. The attention felt warm and flattering, especially coming from someone so respected. Their connection grew quietly, shielded by the late hours and dim corners of the hospital. Celina felt as if someone finally saw her beyond her uniform and responsibilities. She believed she had found someone who understood her struggles and admired her dedication. But their connection existed only in secret. Keiran made sure of that. He insisted on privacy, warning her that the hospital had strict rules about workplace relationships. Celina agreed, wanting to protect both of their careers. For a while, she allowed herself to be happy. But as quickly as the relationship began, it ended. Without warning, Keiran became distant. He avoided her gaze, skipped their usual late-night conversations, and began treating her no differently than any other nurse. When Celina tried to reach out to him, he responded with cold indifference. She blamed herself. Perhaps she had misunderstood his feelings, or perhaps she had expected too much. She tried to bury her emotions and continue her work, but each shift felt heavier. 2 months later, she discovered her pregnancy. The moment she saw the result, her entire world tilted. Fear tightened her lungs, and she sat motionless on the bathroom floor of her rented room, staring at the test with shaking hands. A child would change everything. Her job, her visa, her stability, they all depended on maintaining a clean record. Pregnancy outside marriage was already frowned upon by many people back home, but pregnancy involving a superior at a foreign hospital, that could destroy not only her career, but her family's hopes. Celina felt trapped in a new, terrifying reality. She kept the secret to herself. She wore loose uniforms and avoided break rooms so no one would notice her discomfort. During shifts, she moved carefully, hiding the fatigue that came with the first trimester. She stopped joining coworkers after work, choosing instead to lie quietly in her room and worry about the future. Her appetite changed, and she began losing weight instead of gaining it. Stress clouded her thoughts, and even the simple tasks she had mastered felt overwhelming. Despite her fear, she tried to contact Keiran. She left short messages asking to talk. Days passed with no reply. Every notification on her phone sparked a mix of hope and dread. When he finally responded with a brief message saying he was busy, Celina understood the truth. She was alone. Her secret grew harder to hide. Her landlord noticed vitamins left on the table. Neighbors overheard her vomiting in the mornings. Someone found a prenatal booklet in the trash and began gossiping in hushed voices. Celina overheard them one night and felt her chest tighten. She knew the news would eventually reach her workplace, and when that happened, her life in Singapore would collapse. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her, she wondered how things had spiraled so quickly. She wished she could turn back time, undo the choices that led her here. But life offered no rewind. She had to face whatever came next. She didn't know that a black car was parked outside her building that very moment. She didn't know someone was watching the entrance of her apartment. And she didn't know her secret had already reached the one person she feared most. And she didn't know that her disappearance was only days away.
Detective Soren Hale knew missing person cases often started with confusion. People panicked, assumed the worst, and imagined scenarios far darker than reality. But from the moment he entered Celina Aragoza's silent apartment, he sensed something was terribly wrong. Her room was too neat, the bed perfectly made, the uniforms folded on a chair, her ID badge sitting on the desk. It looked like she had stepped out for a moment and never returned, frozen in time. Nothing suggested she planned to leave permanently. Missing persons often left hints, clutter, packed bags, messages, or emotional notes. Celina left none. It was as if her life had been paused against her will. Soren expanded the search beyond her neighborhood. He requested CCTV footage from nearby streets. Cameras captured Celina returning home 2 nights before she vanished, looking tired but composed. After that, she never appeared again. No footage showed her leaving the building, no taxis stopping outside, and no buses recording her boarding. It was as if she had evaporated. This impossibility made Soren suspect one thing: someone else had been involved. He began tracing connections in her life. Colleagues described her as quiet, responsible, and deeply private. None mentioned friends outside work. None recalled her missing shifts before, and none believed she would leave without telling someone. But one nurse, hesitant and uneasy, mentioned something that piqued Soren's interest. She whispered that Celina once seemed unusually close to Dr. Keiran Solace. This small detail turned into a thread Soren began pulling. He reviewed hospital logs, digital keycard entries, and parking data. He found irregularities in Keiran's schedule, late departures, unexplained gaps between recorded timestamps, and frequent visits to areas of the hospital unrelated to his assigned duties. It wasn't enough to accuse him, but it was a beginning. Soren visited Keiran's condominium next. The building was pristine, reflecting the lives of wealthy professionals. Keiran answered the door with polite calmness. He maintained strict control over his emotions, offering rehearsed responses. His apartment looked meticulously curated, free of clutter or personality. Soren noticed the absence of personal photos, no family, no friends, no traces of emotional connection. It was the home of a man who lived solely for work. When Soren left the condominium, he didn't have a confession or evidence, but he had something else: an intuition. Keiran carried a tension in his posture, a quiet rigidity, as if he feared one wrong movement would crack the mask he wore. The detective had seen that kind of internal panic before, most often in people trying desperately to hide something. 2 days later, a breakthrough came from Celina's apartment building. Maintenance staff discovered a faint smear of dried blood on the service stairwell wall, hidden behind a stack of cleaning supplies. It was small, barely noticeable, but enough to warrant testing. When the forensic report came back, it confirmed what Soren feared. The blood belonged to Celina. The case escalated instantly. Celina was no longer just missing. She was likely the victim of a crime. Soren ordered an expanded search around the building. Officers examined dumpsters, storage rooms, and nearby alleys. A thorough sweep led to another discovery: scuffed marks along the back exit door, as if something heavy had been dragged. This finding aligned chillingly with the blood smear. It suggested someone had moved Celina through a concealed route, someone who knew the building well enough to avoid cameras. Soren revisited the hospital to analyze internal footage. There he uncovered something more troubling. On the night Celina vanished, Keiran exited the hospital after midnight. His car was recorded entering a section of the city with no CCTV coverage. Roughly 40 minutes later, his vehicle was recorded again, heading in the direction of the abandoned medical research facility, an isolated structure once connected to Seravista's former research division. The building had been shut down years earlier. Most employees didn't even know it still existed. Soren suspected Keiran knew of it through old ties within the hospital system. He assembled a small team and made the trip to the facility. It was a decaying structure, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusted fences. The building's windows were smashed, and the exterior walls were stained by years of neglect. To an outsider, it appeared empty and irrelevant. But to Soren, it looked like the perfect place for someone to hide something they didn't want found. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of damp metal. Broken equipment lay scattered across rooms. Old surgical beds stood abandoned in corners. The walls were lined with peeling paint and faded hazard labels. Yet amid this ruin, Soren noticed disturbances: dust footprints, recently moved debris, and smudges on metal surfaces. Someone had been here recently. One storage room stood out. The door hung partially open, its lock broken. Inside, the team found surgical gloves, old plastic sheeting, and a roll of medical tape. These items were not supposed to exist here anymore. Their presence suggested deliberate preparation. What they discovered next changed everything. A large freezer sat in the corner of the room, the lid sealed tightly. The exterior was cold to the touch, a sign it was still working. Freezers in abandoned facilities would normally be disconnected. Soren's pulse quickened. He called for the forensic unit. When they pried open the lid, a cold wave rushed out. Wrapped in layers of plastic lay the decomposing remains of Celina Aragoza. The forensic team worked silently, faces grim. The wrapping was meticulous, each layer tight and carefully sealed. It was the work of someone trained in anatomy, someone who knew how to preserve and conceal. As they unwrapped the layers, they discovered another devastating detail. Celina had indeed been pregnant at the time of her death, but the fetus was missing. The room grew colder with that realization. Soren felt a chill travel up his spine. Whoever had done this was not only capable of murder, they were capable of something far more disturbing. When Soren looked up from the body, he noticed a small discarded item near the freezer, a blood-specked surgical mask. The initials KS were written in faded ink on the inside. And in that moment, suspicion hardened into certainty. He now understood that the surgeon they trusted had crossed a line no one could have imagined.
The discovery of Celina's body changed the entire direction of the investigation. What had begun as a missing person search now became a manhunt for a suspect who had vanished with alarming precision. Detective Soren Hale stood inside the abandoned research building long after the forensic teams left,
trying to piece together Keiran Solace's mindset. Everything about the scene, the careful wrapping, the chosen location, the missing fetus, reflected the mind of someone who planned every detail. Nothing about it was impulsive. The crime was deliberate, calculated, and disturbingly methodical. Soren requested immediate access to Keiran's full employment history, financial accounts, digital records, and travel history. What he found painted a clear picture of a man who had been preparing for disaster long before authorities even suspected him. Keiran had recently withdrawn large sums of cash, enough to disappear for months. He had purchased supplies under different vendor accounts, including travel-sized medical equipment and sterile instruments. He had even visited areas near the harbor where undocumented boat transfers were rumored to take place. Investigators moved quickly to secure Keiran's condominium for a full search. When they arrived, they found the door locked, but the interior strangely empty. Many personal items, clothes, toiletries, documents were missing. Drawers had been wiped clean. Hard drives were removed from computers. Shelves that once displayed medical books were bare. The apartment felt abandoned, as if the occupant had not simply fled, but erased himself. The most unsettling discovery came from a false panel found behind the wardrobe. Inside the hidden compartment was a metal case containing surgical instruments, meticulously organized and wrapped in sterile cloth. Next to it were multiple passports, each bearing Keiran's photograph but under different names. Bundles of cash were tucked beneath the passports, as if ready for quick transport. The presence of these items confirmed that Keiran had been building an escape plan for months, possibly even years. Soren studied each item with a sinking feeling. This was not the behavior of someone who panicked. This was the behavior of someone who anticipated exposure and created a solution. It suggested that either Keiran foresaw the consequences of his actions long before Celina disappeared, or he had engaged in similar behavior before. The thought unsettled Soren, but he had no evidence of past crimes, only a growing suspicion. While investigators searched for leads, the media caught wind of the evolving story. News channels broadcast updates hourly. Headlines labeled Keiran Solace a dangerous fugitive, a predator who exploited his power within the hospital. Celina's story spread across Singapore and eventually reached the Philippines, where her family held vigils and pleaded for justice. The hospital tried to distance itself from the scandal by releasing formal statements, but public distrust grew. Staff members whispered among themselves, terrified by the thought that someone they worked beside daily could commit such a horrific act. Meanwhile, Soren focused on Keiran's movements after the crime. Using traffic cameras and harbor reports, he traced the surgeon's last known location, a small fishing dock where several boats left without documentation. A fisherman came forward, saying a man matching Keiran's description had approached him late at night, carrying a small wrapped bundle. He asked to be taken to one of the offshore islands. The fisherman refused after noticing Keiran's tense behavior, but he remembered the direction Keiran walked afterward, towards a dense stretch of coastal forest. This clue gave Soren his next lead. The area was vast and difficult to search, but Soren believed Keiran might be hiding in one of the isolated structures used by fishermen. Teams combed through the coastline, checking coves, abandoned huts, and floating shelters. For days, they found nothing except signs of recent activity: fresh footprints, discarded cloth, and small medical waste. These traces suggested that Keiran was constantly on the move, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. Then came the report that changed everything. A fisherman claimed to have heard the faint cry of a newborn near a remote floating hut shortly before dawn. He had approached the hut, but found it locked from the inside. When he returned later, the hut was empty, its door swinging in the wind. Soren acted immediately, assembling a tactical team to search the area. They reached the floating hut at low tide. The boards creaked under their weight, and the structure swayed with the water. Inside, Soren found signs of a temporary medical setup, a portable incubator, surgical wipes, and cloth cut from what looked like a nurse uniform. The incubator was still warm, but the infant was gone. Soren studied each inch of the room. The floor had scrape marks, suggesting someone had lifted something heavy in a hurry. A small trail of water led out the door, indicating the hut had been vacated recently. Keiran must have sensed someone approaching and fled again. The investigation intensified. Officers set up checkpoints along the coast, alerting nearby islands and shipping companies. Soren believed Keiran was not simply trying to escape. He was moving with intention, carrying the infant with determined secrecy. But to what end? That question haunted every step of the investigation. Days later, the cargo ship report arrived. A man resembling Keiran tried to board illegally with a bundled infant. He was turned away. He fled into the coastal forest, leaving officers scrambling to pursue him. Soren organized teams immediately, dividing the forest into search grids. The forest was thick, humid, and filled with steep drops. Officers fought through vines and mud, moving deeper until they found signs of a makeshift camp. A blanket, discarded medical wipes, and footprints leading towards a cliff. Soren followed the trail to the cliff's edge. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying the roar of the waves below. The edge showed signs of disturbance, as if someone had stood there for a long time. Moments later, an officer shouted for help. At the bottom of the cliff, partially submerged in ocean water, lay the body of Keiran Solace, broken, motionless, and alone. The bundle in his arms was empty. The infant was nowhere to be found. The ocean had erased the final piece of evidence, leaving behind a silence more unsettling than any truth Soren could uncover.
Detective Soren Hale stood on the cliffside, staring at the fractured body of Keiran Solace, as waves pushed and pulled around him like a cruel reminder that nothing about this case would add neatly. Paramedics confirmed the surgeon had died instantly from the fall. His neck was broken, his skull fractured, and his wrist bore deep marks from bracing against jagged stone. But the empty bundle still consumed Soren's thoughts. The ocean had taken the only remaining clue, the missing infant who was supposed to be Celina Aragoza's child. Without that child, the motive behind Keiran's actions became even more tangled, his final decision even harder to understand. The coastal search expanded immediately after Keiran's autopsy. Officers combed the shoreline for days, scanning the water, checking reefs, and examining every piece of drift that washed ashore. The hope was slim but alive. Maybe the infant had drifted toward a quieter bay. Maybe someone found the child and carried it away. Or maybe Keiran had hidden the infant before jumping. Each possibility tugged the investigation in a different direction. Soren returned to the floating hut, determined to reconstruct Keiran's final hours. Inside, the incubator's residual heat had faded, leaving only the faint smell of antiseptic. Papers were scattered under the bed planks, notes written in coded shorthand, medical abbreviations mixed with symbols. Forensic officers retrieved them, but no immediate meaning surfaced. The incubator itself showed signs of recent use, with temperature settings adjusted manually and power levels altered every few hours. This confirmed the infant had been alive when Keiran reached the hut. The next phase of the investigation required examining Keiran's past more deeply. Soren visited the hospital's archives, digging into older files, overlooked reports, and complaints that had never escalated. He discovered that Keiran had performed multiple unauthorized procedures over the years, nothing violent, but ethically questionable. His peers described him as brilliant but obsessive, often consumed with theoretical experiments that blurred the line between acceptable research and dangerous ambition. Soren found records of Keiran attending private conferences abroad, events not affiliated with mainstream medicine. Some discussed controversial advancements in neonatal genetic interventions. Others involved experimental surgeries not yet approved for clinical use. The topics alone were concerning, but the frequency of Keiran's attendance suggested more than curiosity. It hinted at a deeper involvement in circles that valued secrecy and pushed boundaries. The missing infant began to take new significance. Perhaps the child was not simply an unwanted consequence of an affair. Perhaps Keiran saw the child as part of something larger, an experiment, a project, or a fixation that spiraled into madness. Soren visited the hospital's research laboratory next, speaking to a technician who once assisted Keiran. The technician recalled a period when Keiran worked obsessively on developing prenatal imaging systems. He had requested fetal samples, which the hospital ethics board denied. He became withdrawn afterward, spending long nights alone in the lab. When Celina became pregnant, Soren theorized that Keiran saw an opportunity to continue his ambitions outside the institution's oversight. This theory gained weight when analysts decoded the papers found in the hut. They revealed a timeline, dates, physiological observations, and medical measurements consistent with monitoring a newborn in unstable conditions. The notes detailed heart rate spikes, temperature drops, and respiratory struggles. Keiran had been attempting to keep the infant alive without proper resources, improvising equipment as he fled. Each page showed increasing desperation, shorter intervals between entries, and more erratic handwriting. The final page ended abruptly with a single line, "Not enough time." That phrase haunted Soren and shaped the next steps. It meant Keiran knew the pursuit was closing in. It meant the surgeon believed something was coming, whether death, arrest, or a medical failure he could no longer manage. But the timing of the phrase put room for possibility. Perhaps Keiran had placed the infant somewhere safe before running to the cliff. To explore this theory, Soren re-examined every site Keiran visited after fleeing the hut. He discovered a narrow inlet below the forest line, accessible only through a steep descent. The inlet sheltered a tiny fishing shack used by locals during storms. Inside, investigators found signs of recent occupancy: a half-empty water bottle, a cloth with faint traces of blood, and a small indentation in a pile of blankets shaped like something had rested there briefly. It was enough to convince Soren that the infant had been placed there temporarily. Still, the child was missing. The investigation shifted once again, when a harbor patrol officer reported something unusual. Early that morning, a small wooden boat had been spotted drifting near the mangroves. Inside the boat were folded blankets, an empty milk bottle, and faint traces of blood on the wood. The officer found the boat empty, but the item suggested a hurried escape attempt. The direction of the currents indicated the boat originated near the inlet. Soren followed this reed to the mangrove edge. Search teams waded through thick mud and tangled roots, scanning every crevice. Hours passed with no sign of life. Light faded, shadows deepened, and officers prepared to call off the search. Then, just before nightfall, one of the search dogs barked sharply near a dense cluster of mangrove roots. Officers rushed over and cleared the tangled branches. In the small hollow was a waterproof medical container, sealed tightly. Inside the container was a folded note written in Keiran's precise handwriting. It contained only 3 words: "Take care now." And beneath the note was a birth bracelet with Celina Aragoza's name. But there was no child. The realization sank in slowly. Keiran had not abandoned the infant. He had passed the child to someone he trusted, someone who reached the inlet before police arrived, and someone who vanished into the mangroves with the newborn in their arms. The case was no longer a closed chapter. It was an open wound, with new questions bleeding through every discovery. And Soren knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere out there, Celina's child was alive.
Detective Soren Hale left the mangrove site with the medical container sealed in an evidence bag, but the weight of its contents pressed heavily on his mind. The 3 handwritten words, "Take care now," felt less like a message and more like an unsettling clue to a larger plan. The birth bracelet confirmed it belonged to Celina Aragoza's child, but it revealed nothing about who had taken the infant, where they went, or why Keiran trusted them enough to hand over a newborn in the middle of a manhunt. The case had taken on a new shape, one no longer centered on a murder, but on an unseen accomplice moving through the shadows. The investigation shifted its focus again. If Keiran had help, that meant someone had been aware of Celina's pregnancy, aware of her disappearance, and aware of the escape plan. Soren began reviewing hospital logs, visitor entries, and communication records for anyone who might have interacted with Keiran frequently but quietly. Most colleagues found him intimidating or distant, but one name surfaced repeatedly in the background: Dr. Arwen Larke, a neonatal researcher who resigned from the hospital 6 months prior, citing burnout. She left abruptly and never returned, but her ID access logs showed multiple unauthorized entries into restricted labs shortly before she resigned. Soren pulled her file and found something else intriguing. Arwen's academic history intersected heavily with the same experimental conferences Keiran attended. They had collaborated on research papers that were later rejected for violating ethical guidelines. Their partnership was described as brilliant but obsessive. While Keiran specialized in advancing surgical techniques, Arwen focused on genetic development and neonatal viability in extreme conditions. Together, they formed a duo capable of blurring every ethical line in medicine. This raised a harrowing possibility that Keiran had not been acting alone in his experiments, and the infant represented something far more important to Arwen's research than anyone realized. Soren built a profile on Arwen. She had no living relatives, few friends, and lived a life defined by academic obsession. Her last known residence was a small rental apartment near the old research district. When Soren arrived with his team, they found the unit abandoned, with furniture covered in dust. But subtle markers revealed recent occupancy. A chair was slightly shifted from its dusty outline. A cup on the counter had water pooled inside it. And in the bathroom, a faint trace of baby powder lingered in the air, too fresh to be accidental. Soren scoured the apartment and found a hidden drawer beneath the kitchen sink. Inside was a burner phone with only active contact, the number belonging to Keiran Solace. Call logs showed regular communication between them until 2 days before Keiran's death. The timing aligned perfectly with the disappearance of the infant. Arwen must have followed Keiran's trail, retrieved the infant from his makeshift hideout, and fled before authorities arrived. The burner phone also contained a partially typed message never sent. It read, "The child will survive. You were right about—" The message ended mid-sentence, as if Arwen had been interrupted. The lack of completion left a void filled with unsettling possibilities. While the lab analyzed this new evidence, Soren expanded the search to ports, airports, and land borders. None showed a woman matching Arwen Larke's description traveling with a newborn. That meant she was still in the country or had taken a route beyond official channels. Soren considered the possibility of her using medical transport companies or private vessels. He contacted the maritime authorities to check logs of private boats leaving Singapore in the last 72 hours. One vessel stood out, a small, privately owned medical transport boat used occasionally by research organizations. It had departed shortly after Keiran's death and had not returned. The vessel was registered to a subsidiary of an old bio-research foundation linked to one of Arwen's mentors. The foundation had dissolved years ago, but the assets remained scattered, unmonitored, and easily exploited. Soren became certain Arwen had used the vessel either to leave Singapore or to access remote islands where she could continue her work undetected. Search aircraft were deployed along potential routes. Hours passed without results, until a pilot reported a small, nearly camouflaged structure on a remote island known for housing abandoned military outposts. Soren organized a tactical team and flew there at sunrise. The island was overgrown, silent and shrouded in mist. As the team approached the structure, they found signs of life, footprints in the dirt, recently cut branches, and a faint scent of sterilizing chemicals lingering near the entrance. The wooden door hung slightly open, swaying with the wind. Inside, the interior resembled a compact medical shelter. Equipment was arranged with surgical precision. An improvised incubator sat in a corner, still warm. The sheets inside carried impressions of a small body, but the infant was no longer there. Soren searched the space meticulously. On a metal table lay a journal filled with Arwen's handwriting. The entries detailed her mission in cold clinical terms, observations of the infant's growth, notes about environmental stress responses, and references to continuing Celina's legacy. Arwen seemed convinced she was fulfilling a scientific purpose, not committing a crime. The final entry chilled Soren more than anything else in the case. The child is ready for Phase 2, relocating to a safer site. Keiran's sacrifice will protect us both. The realization hit hard. Arwen had anticipated the police would find this island. She wanted them to find it. Every detail, the warm incubator, the open door, the journal, was staged to taunt the investigation or lead them in a specific direction. Arwen was always one step ahead, crafting a trail designed to create urgency without allowing capture. Soren followed footprints leading from the shelter to the island's far edge. There, a small dock extended into the water. Rope marks indicated a boat had been tied there recently and departed hours earlier. A single item floated near the dock, a pacifier drifting gently on the waves. Soren picked it up and felt the weight of the moment. The infant had been alive mere hours before. Arwen was moving rapidly, using pre-planned routes to evade detection. The case, once believed to be near its conclusion, was now evolving into a disappearance far more complex and chilling than the murder that began it. Celina was dead, Keiran was dead, and out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, a child, born of secrecy, was being taken deeper into a world shaped by two dangerous obsessions. Soren knew now that this was no longer just a search for a missing infant. It was a hunt for a woman who believed she was rewriting the future.
Detective Soren Hale felt the weight of the case deepen with every new revelation. Arwen Larke was no longer just a missing researcher or a suspect. She had become a ghost in motion, leaving just enough traces to show she was alive but never enough to reveal her direction. Every clue she dropped felt intentional, carefully curated, as if she were controlling the pace of the investigation. The abandoned island lab, the warm incubator, the journal describing the infant as part of some twisted Phase 2, they were breadcrumbs meant to taunt, not confessions. Arwen believed she was ahead, and for now, she was right. Back at headquarters, analysts pieced together everything collected so far. Soren gathered his team in the briefing room, now covered wall to wall with maps, timelines, and photographs. He pointed to a network of offshore islands circled in red. These locations were once part of Singapore's extended medical and military research infrastructure, many abandoned, others privately leased, and a few still unaccounted for. Arwen had access to old records from her research affiliations, giving her knowledge of isolated sites perfect for disappearing. The Maritime Division reported a small vessel matching the description of the medical transport boat, moving west toward regions dense with small, uninhabited islands. Tracking became difficult in those waters, where radar signals often broke against natural rock formations. But satellite imagery offered a lead. One of the islands had a heat signature consistent with temporary habitation, a faint glow recorded late at night. It wasn't proof, but it was the closest lead they had. Soren organized a covert reconnaissance mission. 2 boats carrying officers and medical personnel traveled under the cover of night. As they approached the island, fog rolled across the water, making visibility difficult. The waves slapped against the boats with an unpredictable rhythm. When they reached the shore, the sand was marked with recent footprints leading deeper into the trees. The prints varied in size, one set clearly from an adult, the smaller impressions suggesting an infant carried close to the ground for balance.
The team followed the trail up a gentle slope to a natural cave, partially obscured by vines. The entrance had been reinforced with wooden boards. A faint hum came from inside, almost mechanical. Soren signaled for silence and advanced slowly. Inside the cave, artificial light flickered on silver foil insulation panels taped to the rock walls. A portable generator buzzed softly. Medical supplies were scattered on tables, with notes organized into neat stacks. But once again, Arwen was gone. The incubator in the center was empty, although it was still warm. A small blanket lay neatly folded beside it, embroidered with Celina's initials in delicate thread. Soren picked it up and felt a sinking ache in his chest. Arwen had taken the time to fold it with precision, another message indicating she was in control. On a flat stone surface nearby, a tiny audio recorder blinked red. Soren pressed play. A soft, distorted voice filled the cave. Arwen's voice, calm and emotionless. She spoke about the infant's survival, her achievements, and her belief that the child represented a new beginning, untouched by the constraints of traditional ethics. She referenced Keiran as a necessary loss, and spoke of continuing the mission they once shared. Then came a final chilling line. "You are close, Detective Hale, but not close enough." Then the recording clicked off. Soren clenched his jaw. Arwen wasn't just running, she was leading him somewhere. But for what purpose? To brag? To distract? Or to ensure he arrived at a specific location at a predetermined time? Forensic teams collected every item from the cave. Analysts found a map marked with several crossed locations, some the police had already visited, others that were inaccessible. One island, farther from the rest, had a small circle around it. It was one of the last abandoned research outposts built decades ago, rumored to have underground medical chambers with their own power source. The outpost was difficult to reach due to treacherous currents and underwater rock formations. It was the perfect hideout. Soren didn't wait for full backup. He took a smaller vessel with a searchlight and headed straight for the final island. The journey was rough. The ocean swelled unpredictably, and jagged rocks lurked beneath the surface. After hours of navigating, the silhouette of a forgotten outpost emerged. A rusted tower rising above tangled vegetation, connected to a concrete structure half swallowed by vines. Soren approached carefully. The island was silent, except for waves and distant seabird cries. The concrete door of the outpost was slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of metal and salt. Rusted gurneys lined the hallway. Old cables dangled from the ceiling. He followed the faint glow of emergency lights deeper inside until he reached a room that looked recently used. In the center of the room was a cradle made from a repurposed medical drawer. Blankets padded the interior, freshly washed and warm. Next to it was a feeding bottle, half full of milk. The child had been here very recently. Soren's flashlight scanned the walls. More notes, more medical charts, more evidence of Arwen's methodical care. Except this time she had left something different. On the far wall hung a photograph pinned by a scalpel. In the image, Arwen held the infant close to her chest, half her face hidden by shadow. The baby's eyes were open and alert. Behind Soren, a faint click echoed across the hallway. He spun around, weapon raised, but saw no one, only darkness. Then he noticed an open maintenance hatch on the opposite side of the room. Fresh footprints led inside, muddy, wet, unmistakable. Arwen had been there minutes ago. Soren crawled into the hatch. It opened into a narrow tunnel leading back toward the shore. He followed it until the tunnel ended abruptly at a rocky ledge above the water. Early morning light reflected off the waves. At the waterline, the faint outline of a boat's wake rippled across the surface, evidence of a departure. Arwen was gone again, the infant with her. Soren stood on the ledge, breathing heavily, watching the wake fade into the horizon. He felt a deep truth settle inside him. This was not a case with a clean ending. Arwen was too smart, too prepared, too consumed by her beliefs to be caught easily. She would keep moving until she felt her mission was complete, whatever that truly meant. The official report would eventually record that the primary suspects were deceased and the child remained missing. But Soren knew the reality. The child was alive. Arwen was still out there, and somewhere, far beyond the maps pinned in the briefing room, a new chapter of the story was quietly beginning. Detective Soren Hale remained on the rocky ledge long after the boat's wake dissolved into the morning light. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, hiding answers somewhere beneath its shifting, glittering surface. Arwen Larke was gone again, carrying Celina Aragoza's infant deeper into her twisted vision of science. The cold truth pressed on him. He could no longer pretend this was a case that would end with a simple capture. Arwen was not a fugitive in the traditional sense. She was a zealot with a mission, a woman convinced she was creating a legacy that others were too small-minded to understand. And she would flee to the edges of the earth if necessary. Back on the mainland, the investigative team reviewed everything from the abandoned outpost. Photographs, audio recordings, maps, and medical notes were spread across long tables. Analysts worked tirelessly, tracing Arwen's movements, studying her handwriting, isolating keywords from her research. But everything pointed to a single conclusion. Arwen had crafted a deeply complex escape path long before Celina ever went missing. Her preparation was not impulsive. It was years in the making. Soren focused on the photograph Arwen left pinned to the wall at the outpost. It showed her holding the infant, her expression hidden in the shadows. Investigators enhanced the image, revealing faint details in the background, a metal shelf, a window with thick vegetation outside, and a distinct pattern of rust on the wall. These clues narrowed down the possible location she had stayed at previously, but not where she was going next. An intelligence liaison suggested monitoring communications connected to old research networks. Many were inactive, but a few obscure message boards and encrypted forums still had occasional traffic. One thread caught their attention, a series of coded messages posted shortly before Keiran's death. The language resembled Arwen's shorthand. Analysts decoded part of it, references to sanctuary zones, elevated resilience, and offspring viability. These terms aligned with her scientific interests, but not with any known organization. It hinted at a wider, underground community of researchers pushing forbidden boundaries. If Arwen was connected to such a group, she wouldn't remain isolated. She had allies, people willing to hide her, support her, and justify her actions. Meanwhile, the public narrative spiraled. News outlets sensationalized the story. The murdered nurse, the rogue surgeon, the missing infant, and now a brilliant but unhinged researcher evading capture. Online discussions were frantic. Some speculated that the baby had died. Others believed the child was being used for illegal experiments. Conspiracy theories multiplied. The Philippines demanded answers. Singapore's health authorities held press conferences to assure the public that the medical system was not compromised. But every assurance sounded hollow when paired with the reality of Arwen Larke's escape. Soren felt the pressure intensify. He reviewed Arwen's old research proposals, focusing on the ones rejected for ethical violations. One particular project proposal stood out: the development of specialized neonatal care methods for infants born under extreme biological circumstances. The proposal was vague, hinting at genetic anomalies and experimental interventions. It was also co-authored by Keiran. Soren realized that Celina's child might have been central to these plans. An infant they believed possessed unique traits, whether real or imagined. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the connections became. Arwen had been obsessed with genetic resilience. Keiran had been obsessed with surgical innovation. Together they created a delusion powerful enough to drive them to murder and flee with an infant. Soren understood now. They believed the child represented a scientific breakthrough. But what that breakthrough was, or whether it even existed, remained unknown. While investigators combed through Arwen's academic history, Soren returned to the marine records. The final island outpost had been abandoned years ago by a private research foundation linked to Arwen's mentor, Dr. Kessler Drown. The foundation had dissolved quietly, but its remaining resources were scattered across multiple countries. Soren dug deeper and found something chilling. One of the foundation's old vessels had been sighted near Indonesian waters just weeks before Celina's disappearance. The vessel's ownership had been transferred multiple times, often to shell companies. It was now untraceable. If Arwen had contact with anyone tied to Drown's network, she could access hidden facilities far outside Singapore's jurisdiction. Soren coordinated with international agencies. Alerts were sent to maritime authorities in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Satellite surveillance targeted abandoned islands, unmapped coves, and obscure private docks. But every day that passed without a sighting weighed heavily. Infants were fragile. Even with Arwen's medical expertise, survival in constant transit was precarious. Then, on the 5th night after Arwen fled the outpost, a fishing crew reported seeing a woman with an infant boarding a weathered, unregistered vessel off a remote Indonesian shore. The description matched Arwen closely. Same height, same posture, same distinct movement of cradling something to her chest. The vessel left heading south, toward regions filled with hidden islands and labyrinthine waterways. It was the first verifiable sighting since the outpost, but instead of relief, Soren felt dread. Southward meant fewer patrols, fewer eyes, fewer laws, and countless hiding places. He boarded a surveillance aircraft to follow the reported route. From above, the sea stretched into a maze of reefs, mangroves, and scattered islands, some no larger than a house, others covered in dense jungle. The aircraft scanned tirelessly, but the vessel was small and painted to blend with the water, easily lost among natural formations. The pilot announced a potential match on infrared, a small craft heading toward an island shaped like a crescent. As they descended, Soren saw a structure hidden beneath the thick canopy, metal roofs barely visible through the leaves. It wasn't a simple hut. It was larger, reinforced, and with what looked like solar panels. The place was prepared for long-term habitation. As the aircraft prepared to land on a nearby beach, a sudden burst of noise crackled through the headset. The pilot swore under his breath. Smoke rose from the tree line. The structure was burning. Soren leaped out the moment the wheels touched the sand. His boots sank into wet earth as he sprinted toward the smoke. Flames licked through the metal roof, bending steel like paper. The heat was intense. Trees around the structure crackled. He searched desperately for signs of movement, footprints, discarded items, anything. Then he saw them. Tiny footprints in the mud. Smaller than before, more developed. They disappeared into the jungle brush. Not alone. Beside them were adult footprints, long, deliberate, and leading toward the dense interior. Arwen had not died in the fire. She had destroyed the evidence and moved again. Soren stood in the smoke-filled clearing, heart pounding, watching the footprints trail into darkness. He understood now. Arwen was not just escaping. She was evolving her methods, adapting with each pursuit. The infant was no longer a helpless newborn. Time was not on his side, and the hunt was far from over.